Professor Mitchell, thank you very much. The next speaker is the head of the Resilience Practice Education Unit, Professor Satoshi Fujii of Kyoto University. Professor Fujii, please take the floor.
So your talk is excellent. Actually, your talk includes the most important point. So that is what is the constraint of the governmental behavior. Thank you very much. 皆さん、お忙しいところ
Thank you so much for coming here. We know you are extremely busy and we appreciate your being here. I hope you enjoyed Bill Mitchell's presentation. The most important point, what is it? What's the most important point of MMT? I personally published this new book on the economic theory of MMT. And I tried to explain what MMT is all about. And that was complicated work. What is the answer? That abstract, socialistic, or scientific question? Or in newspapers, MMT is referred to as being hearsay or outrageous. Should I start there? There could be different ways to write about it, so I came up with the following definition. What are the constraints on the behavior of government action? And this is a theory of advocating change to the constraints of government behavior. And when Professor Stephanie Kelton came for the first installment of this series, I might have touched upon that. Do you remember that? Maybe many of you are coming here for the first time, so let me repeat. At the moment, the Japanese government has set the goal of a primarily balanced surplus. And you consider, therefore, tax revenue as one constraint. And expenditure by the government should fall within that ceiling, or the expenditure should be kept so that deficit will not go above this threshold. But what about typhoon? No matter how many injuries and casualties and the impact to the local economy is felt, and no matter how much inequality widens, this is the amount of tax revenue, so government action should be constrained by this threshold. That's the basic policy of the current government. I think this is extremely unethical and immoral. Government should be a being of ethics. Government have to be moral, justice, fairness, and transparency ought to be the principles. But they are saying, oh, because of fiscal constraint, we only have this amount of tax revenue, so this is the action we can take up to this level. No matter how many people die, no matter how much inequality widens, no matter how heavily local economies are hit, this is all we can do. That's how they are. Since 20 years ago, that's been the assertion of the government. Why? There's this thing called the Ministry of Finance. When the new Ministry of Finance was born, they came up with the law for the establishment. Article 1 says this ministry will set the goal of soundness, fiscal soundness. That's the first article. So there is this nation state called Japan, and one ministry says that their biggest goal is to maintain the soundness of the wallet of this nation. If the wallet of the nation becomes wealthier, no matter how much the people suffer, that's none of their business. And this is the root cause of immorality. And this is the reason for unethical behavior. And we have to change this constraint. So I've been telling them that they are unethical, but so many people don't render their ears to what I'm saying. And so many people don't listen to me, politicians and academia. But in pure theory, primary balance goal is set, so they say. Bill said financial constraint is a constraint in mainstream economics. But in MMT, it's not a constraint, says Bill. And however, if there is no sovereignty in the national state, they can't make money themselves. For example, when Greece had drachma, they had currency sovereignty. No longer do they have that sovereignty, so the fiscal constraint is necessary. But Japan, US, and Australia still have currency sovereignty. So fiscal constraint is unnecessary. And he said that that's the most important point on MMT, and that's crucial. That's why in my book, I say that MMT is a theory asserting new fiscal discipline, carved it out from the series of these PowerPoints. But anyway, that's most important, and based upon theory, MMT is about eliminating the unethical aspects of government behavior. So, and Professor Bill Mitchell's his presentation was in line with that principle. So I was much encouraged. That's why I was so thankful for Bill. Excellent presentation from the bottom of my heart, because I was so touched about your pointing out that that's the most important point on MMT. But having said so, there are constraints in MMT as well. Then what are they? They aren't financial constraints, but real constraints. Did you use the word real? What are real constraints? In the real economy, there's certain supply capacity. And the supply capacity, when it's full, then if you want people to steam more rice or must give you a massage or make pencils, there's no machine, there's no manpower. So if there is no supply, then that will cause confusion. So it's not a financial constraint, real economic constraint. It should be switched to real economic constraint. I don't think he said it should be replaced, but the difference between mainstream economics and MMT is that point. The biggest difference between mainstream and MMT is the constraint, the difference in the constraint. So if you take back just one message, please take that back. If sustaining fiscal discipline is ethical, then I am prepared to support the mainstream economists. But no, it's not just. There's no justice at all. They are hypocrites. From my lens, people who talk about fiscal discipline are hypocrites. So I've been criticizing them harshly with people not really understanding what I'm saying. But MMT says that currency, if there is the right to collect taxes, and there is trust and credit given to the nation state, and if that nation state is recognized socially, then they can issue currency and they can supply currency. So theoretically, in principle, financial constraint does not exist. That was proven. When I read this theory for the first time, I was truly awed. It was great. No need to I don't even have to explain any further. Just read it. Don't spend your time listening to me. Just read Professor Mitchell's article and listen to what Professor Kelton is saying or what Randy Ray is saying. Don't listen to me. That's what I said, but unfortunately, I was the only one who spoke Japanese amongst them. So I humbly have to come up to the stage in Japan because I'm part of the academia. I learned from what they had written, so I thought I'd try to explain that in simple Japanese language. Now, Typhoon Hagibis hit Japan, or Typhoon Faxai hit Japan, and several casualties. Many people lost their homes and their occupation, and many communities suffered from energy supply loss. And at times of recovery, the hypocrites immediately say, where's the source of finance? How can we fund such recovery? So I say, yes, there's plenty of resource. So just do it. What's the real constraint? If it's inflation and shortage of supply, then you have no choice. But there's surplus workers and surplus workers who can be allocated and assigned to recovery and reconstruction. Then the money can be supplied by the government. Now we have Typhoon Hagibis, and then Ara River and Tone River didn't flood, but Chikuma River dam was collapsed. And after some survey, they discovered that some of their dams were saved. But maybe those huge typhoons will happen next year or the year after next. Then the Liberal Democratic Party and government should do something quickly. I asserted that. Then the hypocrites came out and said, where's the money? So I said, here's the money. You've got the money. We can do it. They said communities will collapse and universities cannot no longer engage in research, and then gap widened. Ministry A, B, and C. Ministry A should do this and that. B should do this and that. In agriculture, this should be done. For local economy, this ought to be done. Transport and environment. Many people say different things, and then you ask the Ministry of Finance for a budget, and then come the hypocrites, and you're probably fed up with this talk. But I've been so frustrated. Unless there's excessive inflation, radical inflation, all we have to worry about is the real economy constraint. And fairness and justice can be exercised by the government. They can do that. And why not? Why don't they then? And they said, because we don't have the money. No, you have the money. Why not is the point of MMT. So I've studied that from such perspective. I prepared some PowerPoints, so very briefly, let me go through the documents. But if you want to do more reading, please buy this. I don't know the reason why, but they're piled up at the back. But this could be a backup reading for today's presentation. So people say MMT is outrageous. Many newspaper articles on that, and many well-known economists would say that it's a hearsay to say that fiscal deficit can expand infinitely. But those are all misunderstandings. Second point, is it really heresy? No. Unorthodox? No. When I did this debate with Professor Bill Mitchell, he said all the time, we're on the shoulders of giants. Then who are the giants? These are the giants. Knapp, Keynes, Minsky, Lerner, Weber, Schumpeter. They took over such theory. Ray Kelton, Mitchell, MMT exists. So it's not unorthodox. It's based on longer than 100 years of tradition. It's a traditional economic principle, and it lies on the shoulders of the giants. And that's the first point. And I say this sometimes, but there is the two schools of tea ceremony in Kyoto, Omote and Ura. And in one time, the Omote school is dominant in certain period. Ura is dominant by chance. And by chance, in this post-Keynesian era, many people may consider MMT as being minor, but that's only by chance. It is a theory based on strong tradition. And The scholars criticize MMT that we shouldn't allow fiscal deficit to expand forever, infinitely. But that's a misunderstanding. There is the constraint of the real economy. So when they get that point, they would probably discover that their criticism is based upon misunderstanding. So there is those blasphemy, but it's based not on evidence. So those who really study the theory will understand that it is a spotless theory. So let me give you the overview of the MMT theory and concept. And I try to interpret this so that I can explain in plain language. 7 points. The Japanese government has set the price stability goal of 2%. It could be higher, but inflation above 4% may not be desirable, but various fiscal, monetary, and tax policy should be implemented so that inflation falls within the range of 2 and 4%. So deflation or excessive inflation should be avoided. And even then, if inflation does not fall in the appropriate range, then the inflation should be optimized through adjustment of the currency supply by the government. So when you cook, you may use various ingredients like bacon or soup stock, and then finally you try to optimize the taste by salt. That's like fiscal policy. You do many things, but in the end, you adjust the salt level. It's difficult to have the right salt level just through bacon, so you need that final touch of fiscal policy, or else it doesn't become delicious. In other words, I wrote this. Switch the discipline of fiscal policy from surplus primary balance to optimized inflation. It's simple. You do many things like sometimes the critics of MMT say that it's wrong to try to adjust for inflation only through fiscal policy, but that's a misunderstanding. Built-in stabilizer is most strongly asserted by MMT. In other words, MMT is trying to seek the adjustment in inflation automatically. Albert Lerner says the optimum fiscal policy, even that should be circumvented according to some MMT scholars. But as I said, you have to have that final touch of salt, or else you don't get the preferred taste. So 7 points. 7 points to theoretically understand the MMT. Fiscal deficit is currency supply. If the government uses money, then the money circulates to the people. This is a fact. And Professor Mitchell talked about this several times. This is not my personal opinion by any means. It's just a plain fact. It's just a lens to interpret the actual phenomenon on ground. So it's not an opinion, it's a fact. This is a mobile phone. This is a microphone. And fiscal deficit is money supply, currency supply. And the ceiling of fiscal deficit is excessive inflation, and it's not primary balance. Deflation is the ceiling. And the government is the supplier of money, and the people are the user. So yen-denominated debts will not collapse the Japanese government as long as there's sovereignty. And issuance of JGB will reduce the interest rate rather than increase. And inflation adjustment, there has to be built-in stabilizer. And income tax, for corporate income tax, there are mixed views on corporate income tax amongst MMTers, but under the Japanese current context, I think that corporate income tax also should be reinforced. And job guarantee program as a stabilizer is talked about in MMT, but the point is try to come up with a system that would stabilize the economy. So what are the basic concepts? Governments never go bankrupt through self-currency denominated debt. And as I said, on the website of the Ministry of Finance, they said that, oh, you said this. You said this. It's on your homepage, right? So I'm originally from the West, so I'm more casual than the Tokyoites, but you can never imagine a government to go bankrupt as long as they're relying on self-currency, own currency denominated debt. So tax revenue is not a threshold. So there has to be a other standard than tax revenue. Then what is that other standard? Of course, it's the happiness of the people. Realization of happiness of the people must be realized, and for that to happen, unemployment has to be low, wage has to be high, and interest rate should be stable. But as far as unemployment and wage is concerned, based upon MMT, the government achieved full employment and basic income 1,000 or 1,500 in minimum wage. It's 750 in rural areas, but in Tokyo it's 1,500. So if that kind of local differences exist, then more people will be coming to Tokyo. So I think we should have uniform minimum wage. But as long as the government pays money through MMT, the unemployment will be extremely close to zero. And if minimum wage is set at 1,000, then that could be applied uniformly nationwide. And BOJ, in fact, it's substantively adjusted. MMTers know because they talk about it, but economists and ordinary people don't really know the operations that BOJ is engaged in to stabilize the interest rate. But as long as BOJ continues to exist, interest rate is stable, although they could tweak a notch or two depending on their judgment. But as long as there is certain level of reasonableness in BOJ, then interest rate can be stabilized. So inflation is the biggest indicator that the government needs to watch for the happiness of the people. So that is probably the one indicator that they should concentrate on. The Minsky moment, the collapse of the bubble, that's a risk that has to be circumvented. So watching the inflation risk and sideways, you should also keep in mind somewhere in your corner the collapse of the bubble. So what's this inflation and deflation relationship? This is a simplified image. Money comes from everywhere. It circulates in the world. Money is like the flow of the water in the river. Coleridge, a conservatist in the 18th century, in a book in the 18th century, says that economy is like the water in the pond in your backyard. Deflation. Then in deflation, the flow is narrow, and then during deflation, the flow is bold. And if the flow becomes narrow, then it's not good. If it's too bold, then the prices prices increase too much. And then if you have that in mind, you can come up with specific policies. I talked about many details, but in deflation, you try to introduce measures where the amount of water increases, the supply of currency increases. In inflation, you have too much water, so you try to reduce the water volume. There are 2 points. Fiscal monetary policy and market environmental policy. I read the MMT book and I came up with this categorization of policies. So there are slight differences between my theory, my matrix, versus the existing matrix in MMT theories. So do you directly adjust the volume of the water, or do you redesign the river to change the flow rate of the water? There are 2 types. So first of all, fiscal and monetary. As long as higher progression rate of tax, then you can stop deflation at times of deflation and halt inflation at times of inflation. So higher the progression rate in inflation, you become rich, but in deflation, people become poor. So tax rate is low. Same applies to corporate income tax. And on consumption tax, this is the worst tax. But politically, based upon inflation, tax rate, as long as tax rate can be adjusted, then stabilizing effect can be expected. It's completely deflation in Japan. So consumption tax ought to be negative. It's crazy to hike that to 10%. It's crazy. So they should have reduced it to 5%. If you had the MMT lens, then people would have noticed it. And they brought a different lens. So, sorry, I used a real colloquial joke by referring to a local comedian, so it's not going to go through the translation. And the interpreter apologizes. So, in deflationary, expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, and the other way around in inflation. As long as job guarantee environment or disaster risk reduction or long-term nursing care, these are projects. You define a project where the focus ought to be placed, but higher infinitely, but apply minimum wage at 1,000 yen. Then people will come at deflation, and not so many people will come at inflation. So that becomes a stabilizer. And for monetary policy, the monetary policy itself is unnecessary. Some people say, some MMTers say it's unnecessary, but the mainstream economists say at times of deflation, easing policy and tightening policy and inflation, and sometimes it's necessary for adjustment. But if you over-rely on monetary policy, then it becomes lens over lens. So the current status of Japan today is extremely crazy. So next, market environmental policy. At times of deflation, by re-regulation, supply can be constrained, and then demand-supply balance could be stricken. So the price goes down faster. And at inflation, supply is in shortage. So you tap on the large companies and multinationals to increase supply to reduce the price. So at times of deflation, you strengthen regulation and turn protectionist trading. But you open up trading at inflation. And immigration, too. You change the immigration policy at deflationary period versus inflationary period. But immigration has other impacts than just economic or quasi-economic impact. So those factors have to also be taken into consideration. In the end, inflation, regardless of inflation or deflation, malignant inflation ought to be killed, which is referred to as stagnation. What is the difference between benign and malignant? The inflation or increase of price goes to wage, then that's benign. But it goes nowhere, or logistic cost or energy cost or purchase of petroleum, then that leads to malignant inflation in Japan. So domestic energy sources and infrastructural development has to be done in order to avoid such malignant inflation. Now, diagnosis of Japanese economy. How many more minutes do I have? No, that can't be true. I have to finish in 3 minutes. But you know that we've been in deflation. Core CPI in the past 2 decades has been hovering at around 0. And so we are at water shortage deflation. Why this has happened? Because consumption tax hike and fiscal expansion, and under Abe administration, wage level has dropped by 10%. So deflation pressure is strengthening. And that's because currency supply is declining, primary balance. it used to be 8% of GDP. Now currency supply is 2%. So Abe administration is footing the brake, the austerity brake. But a must is reduction of consumption tax. Leaving it at 10% for 10 years doesn't do. It should be kept at 8% or reduced to 5%, and issue JGBs in order to expand fiscal expenditure. Why issue JGBs in MMT? Even bond issuance is unnecessary. BOJ should lend directly, but in whether it's JGB or increase of tax, it's JGB. And increase rate, wage, and reinforce income tax and corporate income tax, and stop privatization, stop liberalization of immigrants, stop trade liberalization. And those are what's necessary in the current deflationary regime. I run out of time, so please read the last section at your leisure. And what is money? But this is something I must say before I step down. Professor Mitchell?
Interview from the mass media. So I guess many of them will ask you about inflation. So they always worry about inflation if we are thinking about fiscal expansion. So, so therefore, I think this is this kind of one of answer from me.
Newspaper journalists will probably ask MMT advocates fiscal expansion, then that may invite inflation, so that's bad. Especially when inflation emerges, if government expenditure is reduced, that's what MMTers say, but that's impossible. Why do they say that? There's one reason. Because that's the only point they found for basis of rebuttal. These are children who have been persuaded, and then you say, but mommy, you're bad looking. Because that was the only fault that they could find in their mom. But you can rebut that from 100 points. So I'm trying to choose from which point should we begin. We've been in inflation for 20 years, and why are they talking about inflation? It's like an extremely underweighted person worrying about obesity. And then next rebuttal, and I have countless rebuttals, but MMT says switch the discipline from PB to inflation. 70 trillion is expenditure. Expenditure should rise to 85 or 90 trillion yen. That's it. Specifically in the Japanese context. That's all they're saying. In other words, it's just the amount changing, and the budget deciding process should be kept as it is. And under that process, it's been constrained at 70 trillion. Why can't they control the budget when it reaches 90 trillion yen? I don't understand. If GDP is 1,000 trillion yen, then why not spend that much money? And they're saying they can't. It's crazy. Crazy is a great word. I'm going to use it in the Japanese context as well. And then they can do a supplementary budget, or built-in stabilizer effect can be applied. And there aren't any advanced countries who are suffering from overinflation. And I think this one slide says it all. So this is going to be the real last. Japan is too worried about fiscal collapse and deflation prolonged, gap inequality widened, and in this context, MMT is a needless concern. MMT says fiscal collapse or rate hike, interest rate skyrocketing is a waste-laced word. So we should reduce consumption tax and increase fiscal expenditure. Thank you.